Hey everyone! Thanks for joining us for the next session of our Spotlight on GitHub Advanced series, From Alerts to Action, Prioritizing Dependabot for Impact. My name's Anna. I'm an event planner for Reactor, joining you from Redmond, Washington. Before we start, I do have some quick housekeeping. Please take a moment to read our code of conduct. We seek to provide a respectful environment for both our audience and presenters. While we absolutely encourage engagement in the chat, we ask that you please be mindful of your commentary, remain professional, and on topic. Keep an eye on that chat. We'll be dropping helpful links and checking for questions for our presenter to answer live. Our session is being recorded. It will be available to view on demand within 24 hours right here on the Microsoft Reactor YouTube channel. With that, I'd love to turn it over to our speaker for today. Carlin, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. By way of introduction, my name is Carlin Cherry. I am a product manager here at GitHub, specializing in GitHub Advanced Security. I'm here today to talk about an aspect of GitHub Advanced Security, Dependabot, and the software supply chain. The goal of this presentation is to give you some actionable strategies that you can put into practice starting today to help you prioritize your Dependabot alerts. For those of you that have used Dependabot, Dependabot alerts are a powerful signal, but how do you focus on the ones that matter most? In this webinar, you'll learn how to confidently prioritize alerts based on risk, context, and your team workflows. I'll be sharing some actionable strategies for turning the stream of dependency vulnerability notifications into a clear, efficient roadmap for improvement. I've geared this presentation towards both newcomers to Dependabot in the field of AppSec, as well as intermediate AppSec professionals looking for tips and tricks to prioritize their Dependabot alerts across their organization and their repositories. I'll start by giving an overview lay of the land for security tool notifications. I'll then dive into some prioritization frameworks that can be used, both using the vulnerability context and your business context. Then I'll demo some of the things that you can do in Dependabot, things that you can put into action starting today. And I'll conclude with some key takeaways. So let's start by chatting at a high level about the state of security tools. Security tools can scan your code, right, to find risks to your organization. I'm intentionally being very high level here. Whether those risks to your organization come in the form of secrets, leaked secrets, maybe they come in the form of a code quality risk, perhaps they come in the form of a dependency vulnerability. That's what I'm going to be focused on today. But many of the prioritization tips and tricks that I will share can be abstracted across various risk types in your organization. And you might say, great, right? I have these tools that can scan my code. They can find all of my problems. But then what are you left with? You're left with the list of your problems. That list can sometimes contain tens, can contain hundreds, can contain thousands, and I have seen hundreds of thousands of items. And so when you have this long list, this laundry list of risks that are in your organization, you think to yourself, great, these tools have identified 1,000,001 things that I have to take care of. And that's kind of almost by design. Some security tools can feel noisy because they're designed to surface vulnerabilities in your project as soon as they're discovered. And while this noise might seem overwhelming, it's actually a sign that your security processes are working as intended, kind of ensuring that no risk goes unnoticed. Of course, you're flagging every potential issue. That, in theory, lets you make an informed decision about the vulnerabilities that are most important to you to prioritize and address, rather than leaving a risk that's kind of hidden, lurking, sight unseen. So the comprehensive visibility, even though it's noisy, I do want to highlight that it's a critical foundation for building a secure software, and in the context of this presentation, a secure software supply chain. However, not all vulnerabilities are created equal. Some can wait. Some can wait a week before you resolve them. Some can wait a month before you resolve them, but some you really need to pay attention to and take a look at. You need to urgently address them. So, how do you get at the ones that matter most to you? The answer, if I had it, would be resolving every single problem in the AppSec industry. The prioritization problem is one that many companies, many organizations have always faced, but I'm going to give my perspective. The answer is a combination of business context and vulnerability context. So let's start with business context. What makes one of these kind of findings from your security tool a high priority from your business context? That is going to depend on you and your business. I'll give a couple of examples of things that I have seen some businesses do to prioritize their vulnerabilities and the order in which they remediate them. Just a couple of items that some businesses I've worked with look at. One might be that the vulnerability is found in a critical application or service. So if a particular dependency vulnerability affects a business critical or customer facing application, chances are it's going to be a higher priority for remediation than something that might be used in an internal tool or non-production system. A non-production system or a repository like Carlin's Dependabot demo, which contains probably thousands or hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities. So, of course, critical application or service, that might be one business context that you can use for prioritization. Another might be data sensitivity and compliance. If the affected component handles sensitive customer data, financial information, maybe it's subject to a regulatory requirement like HIPAA or GDPR. Fixing that particular vulnerability kind of becomes an urgent business case to avoid compliance violations and data breaches. Those are just a couple of different business use cases and business contexts. Ultimately, it will be up to you, the professional within your organization, to kind of identify those particular business contexts and business needs that can help you prioritize your remediation efforts. So we talked a little bit about business context. Let's also talk about vulnerability context. The ways to prioritize your security findings based on the vulnerability context are myriad. There are very many ways to do this. I'm going to highlight a few different industry standards that we use at GitHub. So first, severity. You might hear severity also referred to as CVSS in the context of your dependency vulnerabilities. So if a vulnerability is rated as critical or high according to the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, or CVSS, it poses a significant risk and probably should be one of the first ones that you prioritize. Severity is the impact of exploitation if the exploitation happens. So your natural next question might be, well, okay, it seems like it'll be bad if it happens, but how likely is it to happen? There are a couple of different ways to get at this in the industry. I'll talk about three of them. The one that I've highlighted on this screen is exploitation likelihood, or EPSS. So if an alert references a vulnerability with a high EPSS score, it means that there is a strong likelihood that the vulnerability will be exploited soon if it hasn't been exploited already. EPSS is a statistical model that uses real-world data and machine learning to predict which vulnerabilities are most likely to be targeted by attackers. Now, on the right, I have a distribution chart of CVEs, or vulnerabilities, graphed by their EPSS, or exploitation likelihood. And you can see there's a pretty dramatic drop-off as we get into a higher likelihood of exploitation. So again, EPSS is a likelihood. You can think of a likelihood as a score from 0 to 1 or 0% to 100%. And you can see how unlikely it is that the vast majority of CVEs are going to be exploited just based on that distribution. You can see there is kind of a long right tail here, but how many of those vulnerabilities are close to 0%? And that really helps you cut through some of that, the noise of your security tool and say, well, I'm interested in prioritizing the ones that the vulnerabilities that have the highest likelihood of being exploited first, and then the ones that are going to have the biggest impact if they're exploited. So these are two kind of good components that we use to get at that vulnerability context or that vulnerability risk in terms of prioritizing which alerts we want to tackle first. There are a couple other industry standards that I wanted to highlight here. One is reachability. So reachability analysis determines whether a vulnerable dependency or code path is actually accessible from your application's runtime. This is extremely difficult to do reliably and doesn't always work. But reachability, when it does work, is another way or a common way in the industry you might see of prioritizing kind of your remediation efforts. Another similar bent getting at, how likely is this thing to be exploited is KEV, or known exploited vulnerabilities. This is a list that's maintained by the government, saying that if there's an evidence that attackers are actively exploiting the vulnerability in the wild, or maybe there's a public proof of concept that a particular exploit is available, that might increase the rank order of the vulnerabilities that you want to remediate first if something is on KEV. These are just a couple of dimensions of prioritization based on vulnerability context. There are so many different ways to get at this in the industry, depending on what you're looking at, the tool that you're using. Again, you're looking at your business context, you're looking at the vulnerability context. And so I'm trying to give kind of a targeted list of things that you can put into action today with Dependabot that can help you prioritize your vulnerabilities. So let's actually do that. Let's take a look at some of those potential remediation strategies that you can put into practice starting today. Now I'm going to show a demo of how you can put some of those into practice. So we're looking at an organization called Octodemo. This is a demo organization that I sometimes use to just demonstrate some of the capabilities of security tooling within GitHub. We're looking at the Dependabot alerts, which you can find going to the security tab and then scrolling to Dependabot alerts. That's how we've landed here. This is a list of all of the Dependabot alerts within an organization, and you can see that we have 48,000 open alerts. Again, Dependabot, this tool, it scanned all of the repositories in an organization. It kind of found these vulnerabilities. It kind of put them on a silver platter for us and said, okay, go, remediate these now. But you'll notice it's difficult to prioritize just by looking at this list. How many of them are critical? How many of them are, have high EPSS? How many of them are actually used in some kind of deployed customer-facing application? Well, let's take a look. When I prioritize my Dependabot alerts, I typically like to start with severity. So I'm selecting severity, and I'm looking only at the critical vulnerabilities first. Let's see how much this helps. So we went from 48,000 to 4,000. So you can see, all right, we're making some very good progress as we start to take a look at, well, which of these 48,000 open alerts do I want to remediate first? Another thing we could look at is EPSS. Again, EPSS is likelihood of exploitation. We've looked at the severity. So if something is exploited, how bad is it going to be? We are looking at the criticals. Now let's say, how likely is something to be exploited? And we're going to say 1%. So again, this is like a probability. So likelihood from 0 to 1 or 0% to 100%. Let's just say 1% likelihood of being exploited. If you think back to that distribution with the probabilities of exploitation for CVEs, you'll notice that you'll remember that there was a really big drop off as we get closer to 100% likelihood of exploitation. So I like to use 1% as a heuristic, but these kind of vulnerability contextual informations are ultimately configurable depending on your organization and your risk profile. So maybe you're willing to be a little bit more risky and say something like, oh, I only care if it's 5% to 100% likely to be exploited. Or maybe you're interested in severities for critical and high vulnerabilities. Ultimately, a lot of this will come back to your personal business context and your needs and your risk profile and tolerances. Like I said, I kind of like to start at severity as critical, EPSS greater than 1%. So those are two ways that you can get at the vulnerability context. So you're left with 2,500 open alerts. We went from 48,000 to 2,500. And of course, there are myriad other ways that you can look at these using some of the tools within GitHub. One other filter you might use is there a patch available? I.e., is there a solve available for this particular vulnerability? Is there anything I can do about it? And that cuts down a little bit more. So we've taken a look at some of the vulnerability context. Now I'd like to also consider some of the business context. When we were talking about business context, we talked about whether or not this code is used in some kind of customer-facing application. And we also talked about the kind of information contained within said code, like does it contain PII? Using custom repository properties at GitHub, you can kind of tag your repositories to get at this business context, and then you can use that to filter your Dependabot alerts, i.e. get at this repository is particularly important. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at the environment. Let's say we're only interested in production, dependencies that are used in some kind of customer-facing production scenario. We can use that to filter as well. Give me one sec. Awesome. When we filter down to our production environments, that really helps identify the ones that are most important, because we get from 2,500 to 31. So that definitely helps us cut through some of those open alerts to identify which we want to solve first. So environment production. Another thing you might look at is, does this contain PII or personally identifiable information? And you'll notice we get to 0. This is a demo kind of repository. So, of course, maybe they didn't tag with PII. But, you can filter depending on your business context in a variety of different ways. One more filter that you might look at from a vulnerability context, not necessarily a business context, is the relationship of the dependency. So is this a direct dependency, i.e. one that I'm directly calling in my code, or is this a transitive dependency, i.e. one that my dependency uses when they built that kind of package? So you might also filter by relationship direct, because that helps you get at your ability to solve it kind of with a Dependabot alert. You can immediately upgrade that dependency, and boom, the vulnerability is solved. So you'll notice when we do severity is critical, likelihood of exploitation is greater than 1%. This is a direct dependency that has a patch available and that is deployed in a production environment. We get to 2 open Dependabot alerts. And you can see that this is a great place to start from your prioritization efforts. So again, we just went from 48,000 open Dependabot alerts to 2 open Dependabot alerts using a combination of vulnerability context, i.e. Properties inherent or native to the vulnerability itself, and business context, i.e. something that is important to you and your organization. And we've done this all natively within GitHub. So we finished with the demo. We talked a little bit about prioritization tips and tricks that you can use within GitHub. Now we're moving into the key takeaways and recap section. So something I would encourage new and intermediate application security professionals to consider is, what's my business's level of acceptable risk? What am I willing to tolerate? You might look at things like severity. That's one thing we talked about. So CVSS score. If this is exploited, how bad will it be? You might look at EPSS score, exploitation likelihood. How likely is this to be exploited within the next 30 days? And then finally, for your business context, you might look at things like custom repository properties, setting those up so that one application of that in security management and risk management is going to be that you can filter those risks according to your kind of business context and custom business needs. Alrighty, that about does it for me and for my presentation. I'd like to open the floor. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat. I hope that this prioritization session was helpful and interesting. Happy to take any questions that anyone has at this time. And if there are no questions, I think we can wrap it up here. Thank you guys so much for attending and for participating in this GitHub Advanced Security prioritization with Dependabot. I'm excited to have demoed some things. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you so much, and hope you have a great rest of the day.